I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything. Now you be surprised at the info you get is by letting them talk, so I'm letting them talk. Gotta keep quiet, maneuver in silence, to let them in, chalk up their body, another one body.
Hello and welcome to JK+1. I am not your host, PTF. Apparently he's, I know what he's doing. He's been bugging me. 55 text messages about some live Preakness podcast we're doing tonight. So that's what he's doing. I am your host, Jonathan Kinchin. It is Preakness week. So some of you are traveling, some of you are handicapping, some of you are still licking your wounds from the Derby. That's what the Derby does to you, right? It's like you either score out of the Derby, you're living great, have had great dinners, bought that one thing you've been like thinking about buying for a long time, or you're telling yourself, oh my God, I got the Preakness coming up, and then I got the Belmont, I got to figure this out. So hopefully you're in the score situation. If you're not, hopefully your attempts this weekend with the Preakness are lucrative. I want to thank our friends at Qatar Racing. What an unbelievable Derby week they had with You Almost Had Me, who is looking, I believe is pointing to the stake the day after the Belmont. That's what I heard from today from another half of the partnership from Qatar, so I'm hoping that's true. If it's not, then I was just kidding. I think it is. Also Caravel, who I'm assuming, is going to be running overseas, across the pond, and I think I might go. Hopefully Sheikh Fahad and my friends at Qatar can sort me out with a pass here or there. But I'm thinking about going to Ascot. Why not? Ascot, I don't know, whatever. The hat, tails, I'll be there. And then they also had Ever So Mischievous, who I'm excited about seeing where that horse shows up next. So an outstanding weekend for Qatar Racing. Thanks again for their support. And this week, we've got Graham Motion. I don't know why I was thinking Preakness, I was thinking Maryland, I was thinking, oh, wait a second. Animal Kingdom had that unfortunate second, fortunate for Dale, unfortunate for Graham and Triple Crown Lure. But he ran well there. Graham, a guy that spends a lot of time in the Mid-Atlantic. And I thought, what better person to have this week than Graham Motion? And we had a fun conversation. We talked a lot about Animal Kingdom, Better Talk Now. We talked about just his involvement in understanding of grass racing. And that was I started peppering him with questions, handicapping questions about grass racing. So I think you'll enjoy it. But I will stop talking. I'll get you into this conversation with Graham Motion and get you back handicapping for the Preakness. My friend, Graham Motion. Graham, what's going on?
Everything's good. Good to hear from you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time. It's Derby Preakness week. So we'll just start this conversation with Animal Kingdom. One of my favorite horses of all time. You know, his career was interesting because he had like really a couple of big highlights, but even some of his second place efforts to me were like some of his best. You know, I thought his run to Wise Dan, I thought was outstanding. And then also, you know, since it's Preakness week, that run was amazing too, although he didn't get his picture taken on those days.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the coolest thing you can do is show up at Pimlico with the Derby winner. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that, right? Because everybody wants you to win the Preakness if you won the Derby. I mean, other than the other 8 or 10 horses in the race. But everybody's rooting for you. It's just a very cool feeling to arrive at Pimlico with the Derby winner.
Well, let's go back to that Derby. I think there's a lot of fun conversations around Animal Kingdom. John Panagot that used to work with you told me a funny story that he said he wasn't sure if you would remember, but Animal Kingdom's last breeze, you didn't have your badge and they almost didn't let you to the front side to watch the work. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I have an impossible time finding my way around Churchill. I mean, everyone thinks in Kentucky that you know your way around Churchill, right? Whenever I go there, I get confused. So John and I were trying to. We finally got Animal Kingdom to Churchill to have his last breeze. You got to remember, this horse he'd never run on the dirt. I don't think I'd ever breezed him on the dirt. So we waited every weekend for it to stop raining to get him to Churchill to breeze him on the dirt. And then that Sunday, I believe it was a Sunday, John and I were there. And, we got Robbie Alvarado breezed him and we got all sorted out. But now you got to get to the front side. And I didn't know you could cut through the middle and all this stuff. So we finally get around the front side and then we're running up and down and all the doors are locked. So we can't figure out how to get in the grandstand. I think we finally got up there just before he hit the pole, and he worked great.
Look, that was one of those works where, I'd always heard about how important the kind of last work before the Derby was, and how it could really be a sign of what was to come after he breezed that day. Because I think a lot of people forget his work before that wasn't great, right? At Keeneland, wasn't it kind of a disaster? Didn't something go wrong?
He was getting a little tricky at Keeneland. I can't exactly remember, to be honest, but it was really important that we breezed him on the dirt before we ran in the Derby. That was something that Barry and I had talked about. We wanted to see him breeze on the dirt one time.
After that breeze, were you pretty optimistic? I mean, did you get very confident after that, or were you still like, oh, we got a mile and a quarter, we got a 20 horse field, or did your confidence level go to, if I can get a trip, I can win?
First of all, I am never confident. It doesn't matter what I run, I'm never confident. But after we breezed, all of a sudden I heard all the chatter was about my horse, and Robbie was really excited about him, and I heard that Baffert had watched the breeze, and he was like, "That's the horse to beat." So for me, that was pretty cool.
Now I had Mike Rapoli. I had Angel on recently, and they both kind of told the other side of this story. But you got a pretty important phone call the morning of the draw, if I'm not mistaken, from Todd Pletcher.
Yeah, I did. I can't remember if it was a phone call or if we were walking into the parking lot for the draw. And once again, I think I was probably confused as to where I was supposed to be. But I remember running into Todd, and he said, "Look, we're going to enter, but we're not sure this is going to work. We're going to be able to run, so Johnny might be available." And I can't remember going back if he actually entered Uncle Mo or he didn't enter him.
I feel like I remember him drawing the 18. I don't know why. I don't know if that's true or not. I think I remember him drawing the 18 and then scratching. I think maybe because they take the entries early, so I think maybe he was hopeful that he would come around. And when he didn't, I think that they just kind of made the decision. I feel like he entered.
What happened was, so we had Robbie on our horse. This is how it played out. We had Robbie on our horse, but Robbie got hurt on the sort of the Monday or the Tuesday of Derby week. He had a pretty bad spill. I think it was in the post parade. So yes, at some point that week, I got a call from Todd, and he said, "Look, I know Robbie's hurt, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to run. So don't do anything drastic because Johnny might become available," which was kind of fate because Johnny, of all the jockeys in the colony, I would say we were probably the closest. Our kids went to school together. We go back a long way, so that made it a little bit surreal. Barry, Irwin, the Team Vallis felt that if Robbie didn't ride on Oaks Day, it probably wasn't fair to the partners to let him ride Derby Day, to let him ride our horse Derby Day. So he made the decision on Oaks Day that since Robbie wasn't riding, we had to do something. And by then we knew Johnny was available. So I remember, I don't think I even called Angel. I think I knew where Johnny was staying, and we met, outside the hotel room. And I said, "Look, I'd like you to ride this horse if it works out."
Now, another story that I didn't know about Animal Kingdom was how you became friendly with Andy Reid, the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. I guess he came to Fairhill at some point, or maybe came to Pimlico, and was there when Animal Kingdom to the lead up to the Preakness.
Yeah. So the main scout, Brett Veach for the Eagles, He was a University of Delaware graduate. I think he played quarterback at University of Delaware. And he's always been a big horse racing guy. So he'd gotten in touch with me after the Derby and said, it'd be really cool if we could come out to Fair Hill and watch Animal Kingdom train. So he came out with Andy, spent the morning, watched him train. He's a great guy. I mean, I spent a couple of days with Andy because we ended up going back to watch the Eagles training one day. So I've kind of kept in touch ever since. It was a great experience. He was amazed at how many things we do similarly with the horses as they do with the athletes. I went back and, we watched the Eagles train one day with my assistant, Adrian, and Dave Rock at the time. Literally spent a couple of hours there one afternoon and hung out with Andy Reid in the office and just chatted. And it was something I'll never forget.
Well, with Animal Kingdom, looking back at his past performances, I mean, he was a grade 1 quality animal on all 3 surfaces, right? I mean, obviously he won the Derby on the dirt, and then the Dubai World Cup was on synthetic. And you run second to Wise Dan in the Breeders' Cup Mile, you're a grade 1 turf horse to me as well. What do you think was his best surface?
So you got to remember, when he ran in the Breeders' Cup, he hadn't run since, I want to say, February. So when I suggested to Barry that I thought we should take a shot at the Breeders' Cup, I mean, I think most people would have thought that was the craziest thing they've ever heard. Barry was just crazy enough to go along with me. So, I mean, I think that was, I agree with you that was one of his biggest races, probably. I mean, if you watch the rerun of that race, he had the most brutal trip. He didn't get out until maybe the 16th pole, and he was absolutely flying with Rafael Bejarano. But yeah, I think, look, at the end of the day, probably he was a superior turf horse. I wouldn't be afraid to run him on any surface. I mean, his Derby was incredibly impressive. His Preakness, I think he was unlucky. I kicked myself that day because I was a little concerned. He was pretty wound up. And I just said to Johnny, and I should have kept my mouth shut, but I just said, I'm just worried that he's going to be too sharp. Sure enough, doesn't he break a step slow, which cost him the race, I think. So it'd be very hard to say which was his best surface. He handled all 3 surfaces. He was just a great horse, really good horse.
What do you remember? What sticks out to you about that week? With it being Preakness week, and you talked about, there's nothing better than having the Derby winner at Pimlico leading up to the Preakness. What really stood out about that week for you in terms of, I mean, were you like unbelievably nervous, or did you feel like you were kind of playing with house money at that point and you knew you had a good horse and you knew if you could work it out, you could win? Where were you at that week?
I was really edgy because, the day after you win the Derby, everybody wants to talk about the Preakness. So you've already moved on from the Derby. You haven't even really had a chance to enjoy the Derby when you're starting to talk about the Preakness. I must say, I think I was surprised at how much interest there was in him and us. I remember showing up, but my house is about a mile from Fair Hill. And I showed up at the house one morning with a crew from ESPN or maybe NBC probably. And my wife was still in a dressing gown. And I think that was like the last straw. She said, "This is ridiculous." So, things like that. It was just very intense. And you're kind of on tenterhooks because you really want to get to Pimlico.
Yeah, I mean, it's and like you said, I mean, breaking a step slow and Shackelford, got a pretty comfortable trip that day. Not to take anything away from Dale and Shackelford, but I whoever worked out the better trip that day could have won. And if Animal Kingdom would have had a better trip, I think he would have won. And I think Dale would probably agree with that. And then the Belmont obviously was just a horrible trip. At that point, you really couldn't be disappointed. He actually ran pretty good considering the trip.
Yeah. So going back to the Preakness, a couple of things stick out of my mind. First of all, I know what a big deal it was for Dale to win the Derby. So he was gutted that we beat him that day. And he was the one that actually led me down to the winner's circle because, when you're up there in the grandstand, you don't really know where you're going. We just won the Derby. We're trying to get down there. I literally grabbed onto the back of his jacket, and he's like, follow me down to the winner's circle because I didn't know where to go. And once again, I was lost at Churchill. So, I've always been friends with Dale. I knew what a big deal it would have been for him to win the Derby. So it was a little ironic that he came back and beat us in the Preakness. I will say one thing that always bothered me about that day was, we don't run at Pimlico very long, and there was a lot of new dirt put on the track, and we kind of ran in the middle of the track, and I always felt that there was a little bit of an edge to the horses on the inside. That being said, I thought he ran great. We moved on to the Belmont. He stumbled coming out of the gate or got knocked pretty good. And I would imagine, he came out of the Belmont with an injury, and I'm pretty sure he must have done it at some point in the early part of the race. And the fact that he ran so well while dealing with that injury was pretty remarkable, to be honest.
Graham, there's a picture on your Twitter. It says pre-race strategizing session with Cowell Racing in the Maydon Hotel. You guys are sitting in the hallway. What were you guys talking about that day?
So Robert and I have a pretty ridiculous relationship. We've been friends since we were in Europe together. I met my wife that summer. Robert was there. We were working for different trainers, and Robert would always meet us in Dubai. I'd been lucky enough to be over there a couple of times before. So here we were. We arrived with the favorite for the Dubai World Cup, which is pretty crazy in itself. And I think the morning of the race, the girls all wanted to go shopping, but that was like the last thing I could have done. So Robert and I just sat outside in my hotel room discussing ridiculous stories and strategizing the race.
Was the plan that day to go to the front, or was that just was that Joel being Joel, finding himself in places that I don't expect him to be sometimes, or was that kind of the plan?
I was very nervous that night because I just wanted to be sure Joel and I were on the same page. And I find with Joel, you never quite know. We'd watched races together. We'd watched Animal Kingdom's race. But when we actually got to Dubai, the night of the race, I'd been anxious all week because I felt the horse was just doing so well. You're kind of on tender hooks. He's doing so well. You don't want something to happen. He was a little unpredictable at that time. Alice rode him every day, but he was not an easy horse to ride. So A, I was anxious because I didn't want something to happen, and B, I just felt like he was ready to explode at any second. I don't think I've ever gone into a race feeling like a horse was doing as good as he was doing that week. So, the night of the race, I just remember anxiously trying to chat with Joel about it and just coming up with a bit of a strategy. But we just felt that night we could not be too far off the pace at all.
And so, we've talked Derby, Preakness, Belmont. We'll talk Breeders' Cup. We've talked Dubai World Cup. But I want to kind of take a step back because I really don't know kind of your origin story. I mean, I know that you came from the UK, but I don't know a lot about how it all unfolded. So let's start with another big race from the home country. What does the Grand National mean to you? Especially just to kind of the American audience that might not know as much about it. And then we'll kind of work into, because I think we'll probably touch on your family being involved in some Grand National success, and then what led you to the U.S. So we'll go Grand National and then journey to the U.S.
Yeah, so my mom was probably one of the first women in racing back in the 40s, I guess. She worked as a stable lad in England, and she took herself to work every day on a motorbike, which was not something that women did in those days, I'm sure. But she ended up riding this horse called Nickel Coin, who ran in the Grand National and won. And she was probably, I believe it was the last mare to have won the Grand National. It was a year that there were a lot of fallers at the first fence. But my mom exercised Nickel Coin. She hunted Nickel Coin. Back in those days, steeplechasers went hunting. That was one form of their exercise. So obviously there's been a pretty close racing connection because of that. I think my mom has lived vicariously through my career because I think it's something that she would have, she would have loved to have done. At one point, she had an opportunity when we first moved to this country. She was offered a job as a steward, actually in Kentucky, by Mr. Bassett, Ted Bassett. And she just didn't feel like she could do it at the time. But she was really a bit of a pioneer, one of the first women on the racetrack over here. I have an amazing picture of her galloping a horse on Oklahoma at Saratoga with a headscarf on. So, racing is pretty thick in our blood. It was something that I decided pretty early on is what I wanted to do. My dad worked for Tattersalls, which would be the equivalent of Fasig-Tipton over here. Tattersalls is the auctioneer company in Newmarket in England. And so, he was always away at sales, traveling. And the reason we moved to this country was because he spent so much time over here at the sales that we just felt that, I think they felt that it was better for us all to be living in the States. And actually, both my sisters were born in the States. So it's a little bit of a crazy story that my parents moved across the Atlantic twice.
Do you what do you think about kind of the new trend? And it feels like a new trend of, people going over to Tattersalls and buying more grass type bred horses to run over here in the US. I mean, I would imagine that the beginning of your career over here was more trying to adjust to the dirt. And now there's this emphasis on grass racing in the US.
Yeah, I'm still slightly mystified how in this country we don't go looking to buy grass yearlings. At the sales, people still, people still fall on dirt horses. They're not going out looking for top grass yearlings. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think the proof's in what Chad's been able to do with a lot of his clients, going out and buying these turf pedigrees in Europe. I mean, let's face it, turf racing has become such a big part of racing over here. They're the races that fill. The money's phenomenal. The money just for the 3-year-olds alone in the grass racing is huge. So I think there's been a huge change in this country, and it always amuses me really that people don't go looking for grass horses. It still sort of seems to be the philosophy is, well, you try them in the grass if they don't handle the dirt.
And what would you describe if we're riding on an elevator and I said, Graham, what kind of horses do you look for at the sale? I would assume that with your clients, it's different, but do you find yourself looking specifically for grass horses?
I don't think I go specifically looking for them, but if I see a horse with a grass pedigree that I like, I'm not going to shy away from it. That's for sure.
Do you think with your experience and, with your mother's background, also working with Jonathan Shepard for a little while, could I send you a steeplechase horse and we could win a couple races? Or is that something that you've a club in your golf bag that you tossed out?
So I actually tried it with a horse for Jill Johnson, who's a pretty big steeplechase owner, and I had some flat horses for her, and one horse was a little disappointing on the flat, and she said she might make it into a jumper, and I said, well, why don't you give me a shot, and I'll run him a couple of times and see how it goes. And I think I ran him twice and thought he'd do much better with Jack Fisher. So that was my brief steeplechase training career.
How much different is it? I mean, it feels more like, I don't know, just from the outside looking in, who I couldn't handicap myself out of a wet paper sack when it comes to jump racing, but it feels like it's more of a training of a dog type of thing, like a sit and stay type of deal, trying to get them to learn to jump over those things. It's always been very confusing to me.
Yeah, it's actually not that different. I mean, when we worked for Jonathan, there was very little. Look, I worked for Jonathan Shepard. We had Stormcat and we had a horse called Flatterer. So we had this amazing 2-year-old. And if you think how many 2-year-olds Jonathan trained in his career, you could probably count them on one hand, right? So it was always amusing to me that he had this phenomenal 2-year-old Stormcat. And we also had Flatterer. But, they could even train on the same set. It wasn't necessarily done in a different style. Once the horses pick up on the jumping, if they were natural jumpers, it didn't take a lot to keep them ticking over. Jonathan would school them maybe a week before the race. He'd take them and run them down some fences a couple of times. But as far as the day-to-day training, we really didn't do things a lot differently.
And then Where in the journey did Herringswell Stables come about, and where did the name come from? I assume that it had something to do with back home, but I'd let you tell the story.
Yeah, so Herringswell's a village about 6 miles outside Newmarket, where I grew up. My parents had a horse farm there, Herringswell Stud, where we boarded mares and such. And that actually eventually became a breaking yard where after we left, a lot of 2-year-olds would go there to be broken for the big trainers in Newmarket, Henry Cecil. Um, uh, a lot of the big guys had their 2-year-olds broken there. And actually, my wife worked there. So it was kind of a funny story that we ended up both spending time in similar places, my wife and I. And Jonathan Shepherd had always called his Operation Ashwell Stables after the village that he was brought up in England. So I went with Herringswell Stables for that reason.
Before we get too far away from England, a friend of mine, I'm sure you saw this weekend, one of my friends owns one of the 2-year-olds that George Weaver trained that won the 2-year-old turf sprints that's going to go over to Royal Ascot. And I always told myself I wanted to go, but I didn't really, if I'm going to put, like, you see how I dress, if I'm going to put on a coat and tails, like, I got to like have a full experience. I don't want to just go over there and be some mope. I want to be in the royal enclosure. I want to be with my friend who has a horse. I want to go to the paddock. And so I think I might go for the first time. So before you tell me the story about how you watched a race in the Queen's box, you got to give me the Royal Ascot advice. How do I attack this thing?
You got to do it. You need to get a driver for one thing. You need to get there early. You got to go to the parking lot, the big picnic before the races, which is way more lavish than a football tailgate. I mean, we're talking, champagne, fancy glasses. It's a great celebration. Everybody done up in their top and tails. And then you've got a full day of racing, whether you're in a box, which is, the box is phenomenal. And just seeing so many people, and it's just such a different experience with everybody being so dressed up, and it's just a beautiful environment with the most amazing horse racing. So you got to do it. You got to take it all in, and you'll want to do more than one day, I'm sure.
And then how about the time that you watched a race with the Queen in her box?
Yeah, so I think maybe the first time we took Miss Temple City over. First of all, I mean, Ascot treat you very well. They could not be any more accommodating to us when we go over there. And I believe I was up in might have been the day before Miss Temple City ran or the day after, but I was up in a suite with some of the connections from Ascot. And somebody came in and took me aside and said, well, actually, I was having a conversation with somebody. They said, I need to talk to you a minute. I said, well, give me a minute. I'm just talking to my owners. I'll be, no, they said, we need to talk to you right now. So I said, okay. They took me aside and said, the Queen's asked for you to come and sit and watch a race with her. So, of course, I was, being from England, that's a pretty big deal. So he said, well, get your wife and we'll set off. I said, well, I'll get my wife, but my son is here. I mean, I can't not go. Oh, no, there's no mention of your son coming. It's just you and your wife. I was like, well, I can't go and not take my son. So he said, hold on a minute, let me find out. So we ended up going down there with my son, Chappie. And the three of us spent a race or two in the Royal Box, and I sat next to the Queen. And the hardest thing for me was just reminding myself that I was sitting next to the Queen, because it was very easy to get kind of relaxed and have a normal conversation, but you had to sort of keep your guard and just remember that you were sitting next to the Queen. It was very cool. I'll never forget it.
Did you, like, growing up in England, did you know the rules, the do's and the do nots, or did you have to kind of remind yourself of them? Because I mean, I wouldn't even know what they are. I know that there's some pretty kind of tricky things you can and can't do. Did you know those things? Did you have to be kind of reminded?
I went to English boarding school, so you're kind of brought up with that stuff. So yeah, it was fairly natural. I just you just had to. It was very easy to get very relaxed with her, and it's not really something you can do. But it was a super experience, and I actually met her again at another event a year or so later, and we chatted about Churchill Downs and the Derby, and she just had this amusing story that she said to me. She said, we were up in this up in the suites at Churchill, and all I wanted to do was go out and watch the race on the balcony, but the security wouldn't let me go out there, which I was very amused about, that she was sharing with me that the security wouldn't let her do something.
So just if I ever meet royalty, just give me the initial idea. So when you go to shake someone's hand, like what, I guess it's different with the queen and the king, right? Like how you shake their hand.
I mean, definitely take your hat off.
Okay.
I would start there. I
Okay.
think I don't know if you bow to the king. I don't quite know what the etiquette is with the king, but I'd just be very cautious. That's all.
I'm just gonna bow. I mean, you can't go wrong, right? Like,
You can't go wrong with that.
I mean, if you're too nice, it can't. I mean, it's like it's better than probably not bowing if you're supposed to. I'll just go with the bow.
I would, yeah.
I'm a little nervous the hat's not going to fit my head.
The hat is awkward. I will tell you, one of the hardest things I've ever done is try to saddle a horse with a top hat on. That is ridiculous.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I don't even own a suit. I'm getting married in a couple of weeks. I had to go buy 2 suits.
But you need to do it right. You need to go to the right place in London and get the right gear. You got to do it. There's an etiquette here. You got to do it properly.
Yeah, I won't do it wrong. I'll do the whole thing.
You got to get the right waistcoat. You got to get the right, you got to do it right.
I will. In fact, I get married in Italy in a couple of weeks. On the way back, we're stopping in London. I'll probably do a little pre-run through a shop. I'll get my friend Nick Luck to send me to the right place.
He will send you to the right place, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I don't want to. If you're gonna do it, you got to do it right.
You don't want to show up all shabby.
I have a feeling I can't wear one of my shirts, is what you're telling me.
I think you'll do fine.
Let's talk Breeders' Cup. Some of your highlights. We'll share an account. John Panagot said to ask you about how he had run a bad race, or she had run a bad race, excuse me, on a bog course at Belmont, and that Kevin Plank gave you a pep talk in the Belmont tunnel.
Yeah, I remember the most about the day was after the race, Kevin turned to me and he said, "I need to go to a football game." but the irony of it was that we went on to the Breeders' Cup, and I think we were 45-1. Incredible experience. I mean, most of my Breeders' Cup wins have been a pretty good price, really. Maybe not sharing main sequence, but Bellator now was 27-1 when he won my first Breeders' Cup in Texas, which was just, those stick out. You don't forget those days.
Now, with shared account, I mean, like you said, a huge price that day. Were you confident? Did the pep talk work that Kevin gave you, that you were going to be okay?
I mean, I always thought this filly was that caliber. I mean, I think the coolest thing about that year is that I was racing against, and I'm so bad with names, but Henry Cecil had the favorite for that race that year. And I mean, Henry Cecil was my childhood idol. We could only watch racing on television one day a week in England when I was growing up on a Saturday. And I would just, Henry Cecil was the guy that you kind of idolized as a kid. If you were getting into horse racing, that's who you looked up to, right? So here I was running shared account against maybe Midway, was it?
That sounds about right.
Midday. Anyway, so that was a thrill, just to be competing with those guys, let alone being able to beat them in a race like the Breeders' Cup.
And I've, I would imagine Sharing wasn't the first, offspring connection of a fun horse you've had, but obviously I would think she's probably the best that was connected to your previous successes. But when you got her in your barn, I'm sure that was a special moment, but I got to ask you before we get to that, did you think she was going to win on the dirt that day?
Probably not. No.
Gosh, she did it like impressively too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
she
was always very classy, that filly. She was a lot like her mother. Just always did things very professionally.
In the Breeders' Cup, she drew pretty poorly, right? I mean, wasn't she in the 11 that day?
I believe she was, yeah.
Were you optimistic? Were you, and you and I have had some private conversations. You do mention the draw often. And I would imagine that, I mean, it's important, right? In turf racing, losing ground. Were you optimistic that day when she drew out there?
Again, I don't think I'm ever optimistic. I felt really good about running her that year. I hated the draw, but I felt really good about running her. I knew she belonged.
Now let's go better talk now. And we talked about this when we did Cart Talk, but just as a reminder for those who didn't hear it, your first Breeders' Cup win was the same day and the same site of my first Breeders' Cup. So, you know, I like to say that maybe I was your Breeders' Cup. Good luck.
And my first Breeders' Cup too, right? That was my first year I ever went.
See, look at that. And that was my home track. That's where I grew up 20 minutes from there, and that's where I used to go all the time, Lone Star Park.
Coolest Breeders' Cup. That to me was the coolest Breeders' Cup. I mean, maybe partly because it was my first, but it was amazing. We had a crazy time there. A couple of crazy experiences.
What were some of those? What was some of the, it's Texas, so things can get wild down there.
So we got there. So you got to realize, my first Breeders' Cup, we have 3 horses. We had filmmaker Danceaway Capote was running in the juvenile fillies, and Better Talk Now. Second day we were there after arriving in Texas. I'd never been to Texas before. My groom went up to get licensed in the racing office or the licensing office and never came back. I had no idea he wasn't legal. I never saw him again. He was arrested. He was taken to downtown, and that was so. I was now left with just my wife and I and the exercise rider with 3 horses, which made for an interesting time. Not to mention worrying about where my groom had been taken to, which we obviously tried to work with. My wife got bitten really badly by Better Talk Now. He was quite nasty, and he grabbed her pretty good on the arm one day. And I think at the end of the second day, after all this had happened, we were sitting in the restaurant in that hotel where all of us stayed, or a lot of us stayed. And my wife and I were having lunch, and a lady managed to pour a whole tray of Bloody Marys right over the top of me. And my wife absolutely burst out into laughter, and I was obviously not amused at that point after the day we'd had. So I had to walk back and do the walk of shame all the way through the lobby, seeing all my contemporaries in the hotel.
So I got a lot of good behind the scenes on Better Talk Now from folks close to you. So, Jane reminded me of, or wanted me to remind you of, a story of when the morning show station came to see Better Talk Now, and they asked you, the lady asked you to give him a kiss.
I honestly don't remember that at all.
She said she actually did say, she did tell me that you have a bad memory.
Yeah,
she said that. Well, she said that the camera lady or the interviewer was like, "Why don't you give him a kiss?" And you're like, "I'm not giving him a kiss." And right at that moment, he snapped at the camera.
Yeah, he had a pretty mean streak. He was well known for his mean streak.
The extended cut blinker that you used on him early in his career, what was that? How did all that unfold?
I mean, he was costing himself races. He kept lugging in, and the jocks weren't able to ride him, and we just knew if we, Ramon, this was when Ramon and I first hooked up, and he just had such an extraordinary rapport with some horses. I had a couple of good horses around that time. Better Talk Now, a mare called Confessional, and he just had a remarkable way of getting on with these horses. But we knew that we had to do something fairly significant to stop this horse from lugging in, because it was starting to cost him races, and as he was getting better and better, it was going to cost him an important race, and it really did the trick. As much as I disliked having to use it, it really did change him around.
You've talked a lot. I've heard you talk a lot about Ramon, and I've heard lots of people talk. Even when I had Angel on, he said that he's describing kind of Irad's run of dominance that he's kind of in right now, and he said that that he saw that with Ramon as well. He's like one of a few riders. If some rider said, "Hey, Graham, I want to be like Ramon," what are the things you would tell him that Ramon did so well?
So it's probably unfair to compare the two, and I don't ride Irad a lot because it's very hard to ride Irad. But Ramon, I think Irad he's obviously a very clever, strategic rider. He's a very strong rider. He has horses in the right place where they need to be. Ramon, to me, was a finesse rider. he just had a knack of figuring out horses, and I'm not meaning to discredit Irad in comparing them, but to me, Ramon just had a real way with a horse, just the way he sat on a horse. He sat on a horse differently. He hit a horse differently. He had these incredible hands that he just was able to finesse horses, and I think that was he was it just put him above the other riders at the time. He was a very sympathetic rider, although he could be pretty tough with a stick. I mean, he would hit a horse hard. He wouldn't get away with it now, but he's a remarkable rider and just understood horses.
And when you say, just to clarify for those who are listening, when you say it's hard to ride Irad, I'm assuming that because he gets tied up with a Chad or a Todd,
absolutely.
And you would lose him. If you rode him here, you'd lose him next time.
Absolutely. You know, I'm not in New York. You know, obviously we run horse in New York, but I'm not a big enough operation to keep somebody like that, like Chad does or Todd does. You know, so even if I'm able to get Irad, there's a very good chance that he's not going to be able to ride that horse the next time because he's going to ride for one of those guys. And that isn't that's not a diss on anyone. That's just the way it works. You know, he's the best rider in the country. And for that reason, it makes it very difficult to get him. And if I want somebody to be able to ride my horse more than once, I'm probably not going to choose Irad, you know, although obviously we have ridden him with success.
I'm assuming the story's about Better Talk Now, but I'm sure that it seems unique enough that it will, if it's not, you'll know. The race in Sam Houston, where the storms were so bad that the rider didn't want to get out of the car.
Oh my God, that was Renee Douglas. Yeah. I love Renee. Yeah, I was sitting this was pretty early on in my career, you know, and I'm sitting in my house in Florida, and Renee calls me from the parking lot, and he says, "I don't think I can go in. There's this crazy storm here. I don't think they're going to race. I don't think I can get out of my car and go into the grandstand." Meanwhile, my people are calling me from the backstretch, telling me what's going on. So it was just this crazy scenario where I'm talking to Renee on one phone and my guys handling the horses on the backside. I spoiled the story by not remembering whether they ran or not. I think they did run.
You know what's funny is these jockeys, I think it's because of all their surgeries. Gary Stevens is so scared when there's a thunderstorm. It's unbelievable. He literally gets so nervous, and it's like he always said, "I got metal in my neck. I got metal in my neck."
Yeah, Renee was very worried that night. I have another story about Renee that I always remember, because now that he's not able to walk. Obviously, one day we were rushing through Tampa. You know, we'd always get down on Tampa Derby Day, and we'd all rush to catch a plane. And I had left like my laptop at the security, and Renee was like, "Don't worry, I'll get it." You know, and I remember him running back to the security to get my backpack or my laptop for me, which has always stuck in my mind since, you know, he's now in a wheelchair, but such a great rider, such a great guy.
A quarter crack issue with Better Talk Now, when you'd flown to Tokyo.
Yeah, I mean, we got to Tokyo and we couldn't train him because he had an abscess in his foot, and you have to get there pretty early. I think we did 2 weeks quarantine before we even moved to the racetrack. We had also leased out the silks. So there was a Japanese owner, Mr. Sakaguchi, wanted to run the horse in his silks. My owners weren't necessarily prepared to sell him a piece of the horse, so we had quite a lot of riding on this situation of getting Better Talk Now to the race, and really wasn't able to do that much with him. We did get him galloping, I think, the last week before the race, and then it flared up again, literally 2 days before the race. But he actually ran creditably, considering how hard it was to get him to the race that day. Great experience, though. Great, I mean, amazing experience going to Japan.
Yeah, how would you compare it? You know, I mean, obviously Dubai is just a different animal, but their big days of racing versus our big days of racing. I've never been to Tokyo. I've always wanted to go to Hong Kong as well. But how would you kind of compare their big days?
very formal. It's very regular. Very controlled, very formal. I mean, people line up outside the um, the grandstand for days to get in for that day of racing. I remember my team. I only got there a few days before the race, but my team telling me, you won't believe people lining up days before the races so they make sure and they get a good spot at the races. It's an extraordinary following over there. Very different atmosphere. Very quiet. Very controlled crowd.
Before we move away from Better Talk Now, and I got a couple more with him. The first one is and I got this from a number of people, but the day that Shake the Bank opened up 20.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little concerned that day. I wasn't sure he was going to come back. That I think we were a little bit pioneers with that, with Shake the Bank, and he definitely enabled Better Talk Now to win a couple of those races. We wouldn't have done it without him. He had to have pace in order to win Better Talk Now. And I give the owners a lot of credit because that was a very cool decision, and you just don't see that many people do it.
Yeah, so I got a couple of things on that. So what was the process of finding Shake the Bank? Did you guys already have Shake the Bank, or I wasn't familiar with the story? So how did you get Shake the Bank?
No, we bought him. I want to say we bought him privately. We actually we tried to claim a horse in California who ended up getting hurt. And then I believe we went out, Brent and the partners went out looking for a horse, and obviously he had to have speed. So we went out looking for him, and they came up with this horse, and he became a bit of a legend, really. He was a real barn favorite.
Now, I've always felt like, I mean, I look, I've have some funny ideas I'll tell you about about rabbits, but I wonder, like, nowadays, I honestly feel like nowadays, if there was like a certified rabbit, I worry that it wouldn't be digested very well from the public. And I think that's stupid, but I do wonder, do you feel like in this day and age, it could work, or do you feel like, people would lean against it?
No, I think, look, I get where you're coming from with it. It's an awkward scenario, right? I think the piece of Shake the Bank that did make it interesting was that he was somewhat competitive and he did hang in till the end. But he had to be ridden the right way. Otherwise, it was a useless tool. I mean, if you just opened up by 20 lengths and left everybody behind, it wasn't really doing anything. We tried to force jockeys' hands, with weight, and just try and force them to make a premature move, perhaps. Which is a little bit why Better Talk Now won the Breeders' Cup in Texas, is because the European horse, whose name I can't remember, made a premature move, and that's what enabled Better Talk Now to win the race. And that's really what we tried to do with Shake the Bank. But I understand your premises. I think it is, in this day and age of everyone wanting to be so careful and so worry about the taking care of the horses, I think if it wasn't done right, it could be questionable, which is a shame because it's part of the sport. It's part of racing. It's, tactics are part of any sport. And Shake the Bank was a well-loved, well-meant horse.
I told, I was sitting a couple summers ago. I was sitting with Chad and Saul Kuman and Bob Edwards, and I said, "Listen, I got this idea. You guys, Chad, you should start LLC called Set the Pace LLC. You get Seth to chip in. You get Peter Brandt to chip in. You get Bob at E5. You get Saul to chip in. You get like a black and white checkered flag, like in NASCAR, silks, and you just claim a bunch of speed turf horses, and then you just enter those horses and always have rabbits, and you'll never, and that'll be good for you too, right? I mean, it's not going to.
No, that's the other thing, is it does benefit more than just you, because somebody to set the pace, right?
But and they laughed at the idea, but if it ever happens, I will get a royalty.
Yeah.
I will. At least I'll try to get a royalty as much as I can. Graham, Bob Bowman Michael Phelps, coach. You've done some stuff with him before.
Yeah, I mean, Michael and Bob actually got in on a horse not long after he won the Olympics, I believe. I don't think Michael's financial advisors were all that crazy about it. It didn't last very long. We didn't have a lot of success, unfortunately. Bob loves horse racing, and obviously he's a remarkable coach. Somebody I haven't, I used to see him occasionally. I haven't seen him much now since he's in Arizona. We stay in touch a little bit, but a huge fan of horse racing. I don't think Michael came to the barn and watched the horses training, and I think he was more interested in the cats in the barn than the horses, possibly. So it didn't last that long, but very cool to meet him and hang out one morning. I remember hanging out with him at Fair Hill one morning.
When you meet someone like that, did he kind of have did you a lot of times I walk away from conversations and interactions with people and I say, oh, it makes sense to me why that person's successful. If you it's an interesting name for the last couple of weeks, but if you see Mike Rapoli and you talk to him, you're like, I get it. I get why this guy has made billion-dollar businesses, because he's the way he operates, the questions he asks, that he doesn't really take no for an answer. He's interested, he's listening, he's engaging, but you can get it. Did you understand, talking to Michael Phelps, why he was so successful, or did it not really come across in those conversations?
I think he probably actually spent about a week celebrating after he won the Olympics. He was pretty quiet that morning.
The mornings can hit you a little early if you're not used to it.
It's early, right? So those guys weren't used to that.
Well, a few times already you've mentioned Fair Hill, and I've actually never had a chance to come. I've heard it's beautiful. I will come one day. I drove by it once when I was heading. Actually, I was going back from the Preakness to Saratoga. It seems like that's home. That's where you'll always kind of base your operation. Why do you enjoy Fair Hill so much?
Oh, my house is a mile from my barn, literally. So I can come home at any point of the morning, in between sets. Used to be, that was a big deal when the kids were going to school and I was able to sort of maintain some normalcy in what can be a pretty crazy lifestyle. I can do whatever I want with the horses. I'm not beholden to anybody. I can take them out in the field. I can gallop them the wrong way if I need to later on in the morning. I can go to the dirt. I can go to the synthetic. I just have so many options. I find it so restricting being on the racetrack. The brief time that I'll spend at Saratoga with my horses, I often end up questioning why I'm there, because if it's going to rain for a week, we're kind of stuck. Whereas at Fair Hill, I can just take them to the synthetic. I have options. We turn all our horses out. Everybody goes out in either a round pen or a big paddock. It's just so, maybe liberating is overstating it, but when you've been restricted at the track as to what you can do, it's just very, I feel very fortunate to be at Fair Hill. It's a beautiful place. It's beautiful to wake up every morning and go to work at Fair Hill. I'm very fortunate.
What's the thing that you do at Fair Hill the most often that you couldn't do at the racetrack? Like, I mean, do you, is it like an open gallop in a field? Do you do that often? Like, what are the things that what's the thing you do the most?
Take a horse like Speaking Scout, who's been, he was in California this winter. He's come to Palm Meadows. He's a difficult horse to gallop, not unmanageable, but he's just hard on himself. I mean, I've only taken him to the track to breeze the last 2 times at Fair Hill. Otherwise, he just does not go to the track. He just goes to a field and gallops. And, whether or not it'll show in the results, he's just a happier horse because of it. And he's not taking so much out of himself every day. It's just easier on him and his handlers,
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, he was third in the Pegasus World Cup turf. So
yeah, and it's not like run poorly training on the track, but it just gives us another option with him where he doesn't have to do so much of it. He doesn't have to be so aggressive.
Now, is it uphill, or how does that work?
It depends. I mean, we do have uphills, but mostly, behind my barn, I have about a quarter of a mile gallop that we use, that they'll go around several times and then they'll finish up galloping uphill. So you also don't have to do as much with them when they're doing that. You can go a little slower. Um, so there are other options, but I tend to go to the same place every day to kind of keep things simple. But we have thousands of acres we can use here, really.
Handicapping question.
I'm a terrible handicapper, that.
No, this is a I'm asking you for a horseman's answer to my handicapping question. So
Okay.
you'll nail it. I heard somewhere along the way, and I've tried to use it, but I don't. It gets a little tricky at times. But that it's very hard to get a horse fit training on the synthetic to run on the dirt. True or false?
I don't believe that. I
Okay.
don't. I don't get that because you just have to train differently, right? I mean, I hear that argument at Fair Hill from some of these guys in the winter when we only have synthetic. But if you don't think you can get your horse fit, you got to do a little more with it, right? I don't buy that argument.
Okay. If they run well on the turf, they'll like the synthetic. If they run well on the synthetic, they'll like the turf.
Most of the time.
Is
Although
it
I
a,
will say,
go ahead.
the one caveat is I do find horses tend to kind of skip over the synthetic easier, obviously, because this is why people say they can't get them as fit. So it can be a little misleading. Most horses that I run on the grass, and this is why I think it's such a cool idea to have synthetic in New York. So when the races come off the grass, most of us are going to run on the synthetic. It happened in Florida this winter. Sometimes with success, sometimes with not. I mean, all these synthetics are a little different. I think they all take time to get settled. But most of the time, a turf horse will handle a synthetic and vice versa.
So you like the idea that's been unofficially tossed around, almost officially tossed around in New York at Belmont to add a synthetic course?
No brainer to me. Absolute no brainer because we protect the turf courses. I mean, the only thing that I think we have to be careful about, which is a little bit what happens in Florida now, is they're so quick to take them off. But I think, on days at Belmont where there's a deluge and you cannot run on the grass, and, I'm going to run on the synthetic when it comes off, but am I going to run the dirt? Absolutely not. So
Yeah,
you keep the fields together, and you're able to maintain. I get to run. It's a big deal for us to ship to New York from here. And it's so disappointing when we ship all the way up there and they come off the grass. It's expensive for the owner. It's a long day for my health. And those are just sort of simple reasons, right?
How long of a ship is it from Fairhill?
Well, we leave when we ship to Belmont or Aqueduct. We try to get out of here by 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning to beat the traffic. So it's a long day. It can be anywhere from 3 or 4 hours to 5 or 6 if you hit it wrong.
And I would think that also the difference between the way that you mentioned how in Florida where they take them off is that turf course gets beat up because it's so hot. I mean, I would think at Belmont that they wouldn't feel as inclined to protect it as much.
But it will help it because it will protect it. I mean, honestly, to me, I'd get chastised for saying this, but I wish they'd do it at Saratoga because I think the Saratoga course gets so beaten up. By the time you run the big races on Travis Day, the turf course is not in great shape, and it's nobody's fault. It's just because it gets used a lot. But you got those big Grade 1 races around those last weekends, and it's you're just not running on the best turf course.
Graham, describe that to me because look, I understand what a good turf course is and a bad turf course, right? We've heard people say, "Oh, Tampa has a good turf course." We hear these things, and we hear, "Oh, we're running on a beat up turf course," or not asking you to be a horticulturist, but what are we talking about, and how does it affect the horses?
Well, I think first of all, I think most Europeans would be surprised at the ground that we run on most of the time, as far as like the firmness that we run on. I mean, we really, maybe less now and certainly less in New York. We basically run on firm ground because if it's not firm, they take them off, right? It always amuses me when I go to England with our horses for Ascot or whatever, and I'll ask which gallops I can use, and they'll say, "Oh, you wouldn't want to use that one because it's getting too hard." Well, the Gallop they're telling me I wouldn't want to use is in better shape than any turf course I probably get to run on all year. You know what I'm saying? Because it's just in such good condition. Because they're old turf courses, they got tremendous covering of grass. We have a lot more turf racing than we used to have, and the turf courses get pretty beaten up, and it makes it tough for the horses.
In terms of is it more of a they're running on top of it rather than getting into it, so it's a little bit more, it's harder on them?
I think it's harder on them just because it gets cut up. It's chewed up. It's loose on the turns, especially. It gets very chewed up. It's very loose. It just gets a little rough. I will say that people were worried about the Churchill turf. I walked the Churchill turf last week, and I don't normally walk the turf course, so I'm not trying to play out that I was clever or something. I just wanted to see it. I was getting ready to run my best horses on it, and I was super impressed with it. I mean, I thought the turf was in great shape, and you'd kind of heard stories about it not being great, but it was in beautiful condition, I thought.
Do you think
I think it showed that how my horses came out of their races. They all came out of the races really well. So that's what you want. At the end of the day, you want your horses to come out of the race the same way they went into them, right?
Of course, yeah. Do you feel like our grading system here in the US, good, yielding, soft, do you find it to be as silly as I kind of do from a horse player standpoint? There's no consistency in it. It's just complete nonsense. I just basically look at, was it listed as firm or was it listed as not firm? And I don't try to differentiate between good, yielding, and soft.
Correct. It's not helpful. I really believe. And sometimes I think it's just put up to sort of appease people. I don't think it's helpful at all. I mean, it's either, you're either firm or if it's either firm or it's soft. I don't think it's very helpful. Now in England, they really get into it. I mean, they've got guys that walk it and they measure it, and it's a big deal. And I always find they're a little bit to the other extreme, where people don't want to run in it because it may be, like I'm saying, some of their turf courses, when they think they're too firm to use, would be the best turf courses we would get to run on, right?
Do you feel like a lot of your do you because here's one thing I've started to do a little bit more when it comes to grass racing, especially big grass races, especially in the summer when we have rain at Saratoga. I've become a pretty big believer in looking at horses that run well, listed firm, and then run well or not well, listed not firm. Do you pay a lot of attention to what your horse is like, and what does that actually mean? Is it an action thing? Is it a hoof shape thing? Is it, what would you account that to?
I think it probably is. I think a lot of it's about an action, some of it a hoof. I mean, Better Talk Now had the tiniest little feet, and he always seemed to really handle soft turf. So, it's not all consistent in the data that you have. But, I do worry with some of my horses. I mean, a horse like English B, who's kind of an old warrior, he's kind of a hard-knocking, blue-collar horse. I mean, I really feel like he likes to hear his feet rattle. He runs great at Colonial. He loves a fast. He runs good in Florida. So certainly, I have horses that I do think prefer one over the other. I think some horses just handle soft, whereas a lot of horses might not handle soft. You're basically talking about some horses just handle it a little better than others, or dislike it less than others, right? So no, I think it's a valid point.
Graham, I'm selfishly into this rabbit hole of asking you all these turf questions because, like, turf handicap, like on the dirt, I see it very clearly. Speed figures mean a lot. Draw means a lot. Pace means a lot. And it's easy to kind of figure those out. Turf racing, obviously, because of the different ground you can get and the trip you can get and the paces can get really wonky in turf racing. It's always been a little bit harder for me. So I'm just basically taking the last parts of this conversation just to ask you a bunch of turf questions.
I think turf racing can be incredibly frustrating because of all the things you just said. You so often don't have a good trip. There's so many more variables into a turf race, but that to me is also what makes it more exciting.
Yeah, well, just as an example, the other day when I sent you a message, who was the one that I asked you about that won, but you didn't like the draw. I'm
Clitheroe, yes, Clitheroe.
Yes, right,
But
right, right, right.
yeah, I mean, I liked her enough. I wasn't sure. I think the outside draw at Belmont is tough when you go 3/4 or 7/8. Do you not find that when you handicap? It just seems like you're parked pretty wide and you're not very far from the turn.
Yeah, I just look. It's tricky there, and this is one of my things that I struggle with because I think there's a lot of turf horses that like and need cover, and I probably could do a little bit better video work to identify which horses they are. But I hate getting stopped in races. I understand that ground loss means a lot, but if I feel like I have a better horse, I almost just want to be in the clear. I just want to be in the clear. I don't want to get stopped. I'm not worried about those 12 feet of saving ground. And so outside draws don't turn me off as much if I have a superior animal. I can't get creative from an outside draw. Like I don't try to, oh, this horse he had this bad trip and he's got this pedigree and he might want longer and he's getting a rider switch. I can't get creative from an outside draw, but if I'm best, I'm fine.
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that. I also think it's interesting. We always talk about turf riders and who are the best turf riders. Well, by and large, the best turf riders are the best jockeys, right? Because the turf is where you get in trouble the most, and they're just tactically one step ahead of the game, where they know, they know to avoid those spots where they're not going to get out. They just have a natural fifth sense for being in the right place. Do you agree with that or not?
1,000%. Because the best riders, in my opinion, have part of the clubs in their bag is they have the best instinct, which leads me to this question I was going to ask you, but this is kind of the way I look at it. Would you rather save ground to the quarter pole with the best horse in the race and then need a little bit of luck, or tip out at the 3/8 with the best horse and have a clear run?
Yeah, I probably would take the clear run. I do get frustrated by getting stuck down on the rails so often. I have a lot of owners that are adamant about saving ground. It's not always the right way, though. It doesn't always work out. You just got to have so many things work out, especially at a track like Gulfstream. Where it's so hard. It's so easy to have a bad trip at Gulfstream. You so often get buried down on the rail and just never get out.
And the thing about it is, yeah, I get it. You saved ground and you're going to have more energy. But I look at, and I learned this a little bit it's a weird filly that I kind of learned it with, was a Newspaper of Record, where these horses have a gas tank. And, think of your car. Your car can only go fast. It doesn't matter if you have a full tank of gas. Your car is not going to go 220 miles per hour. It can only go 125, and it takes a certain time to get there. What I don't like in those races that we're talking about, where you get stuck on the inside and now you're hustling, you might have a lot more in the tank, but there's only so much run that you can give from the quarter pole to the wire that can separate you from the other horses in the race, versus from the 3/8 pole. If you get out, you can get your full run. You can empty that tank and really get to that max speed of 125 for 3/8 of a mile, rather than getting to 125 for a quarter of a mile. There's only so much ground you can make up in those situations. And that's how I look at turf racing, which makes it impossible to handicap consistently.
No, I can certainly see the frustration for it.
And that's so. Anyways, I'm very. It's certainly an interesting puzzle. But it's just hard to kind of know what to expect in these races, especially in New York, when the paces are always so, they're slow. And I have a theory for why they're slow, and I'll tell you what that theory is. But do the paces of these races affect the way you look at them in New York?
Look, I'm the school of Jonathan Shepherd, so I was kind of my whole philosophy is about getting horses to relax, right? That's how Jonathan did it. To me, he was absolutely brilliant at it. We spent a great deal of our time getting horses to relax, and that's why. Look, it's no coincidence. That's why a lot of my horses come from off the pace because that's how we train, right? That's what we do. But because of that, you do end up getting in tricky spots, and it can be incredibly frustrating. But it's the way I like to train. It's the way I'm comfortable training. Um, it's just to me, it has a better feel, and it's what I've been brought into it doing, I guess. I'm not sure if I answered your question because I can't remember what.
No, no, it's fine because I'm going to follow up into that. Now, do you ever? I mean, how do you feel about a horse that will shut off, that you have taught to shut off, that shuts off consistently and shuts off well? Would you ever tell Johnny or Manny or Joel to kind of send away from there, or do you feel like if you send a horse away from there, everything that you've worked on with them to get them to relax, does it go out the window?
Look, I think the best jocks again have a way. In this country, it's so different from Europe. I mean, that's why Wesley has done so well. Well, it's part of the reason why he's done so well. We are so much sharper away from the gate than they are in Europe, and our jockeys tend to, Edgar Prado to me, whenever he rode a horse, he would always establish a position from the get-go. You have to establish a position even in a grass race, right? Because otherwise, you're already at a disadvantage. So I try not to tell those guys too much. I mean, I'm lucky that I get to ride some great jocks, and I don't change things. I'm not a big believer in a lot of instructions, but I want I think if you ask any jockeys that ride for me, they will laugh about what my instructions usually are because it's sort of put them where they're comfortable, keep them relaxed. It's a bit of a standard joke, I guess.
So here's my pace theory, Graham. I'm just going to throw it at you, see what you think. I think in New York, the riders, and this is not a knock on the riders, right? Because they are, one of the reasons I used to poke fun at how good Flavian Pratt is, and I know how good he is now. I'd made the mistake previously that he wasn't that good because he was in California. It's because I love the New York room so much. I think they're all so talented, and I think it's extremely deep. But I feel like the paces in New York turf races, the reason they look like they look is because these riders would rather err on the side of too slow than too fast, because too fast is much easier for owners and trainers to yell at them about than too slow. Too slow, it's like, it's not on me, it's on you. It's on you, trainer. It's on you, horse, if I go too slow. And so I think they just all kind of have erred on the side of going slower than going faster.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Although I think there's plenty of trainers out there that don't feel, that may not have the same philosophy that I have about how a horse should be ridden or what have you. So, look, a guy like Louis, you see him take advantage all the time. I mean, he tends to be aggressive. You probably, I could be way out of line here, but you probably see Louis win more races on the lead on the turf than most other jocks, I would say, right? He's just a bit more of an aggressive rider.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I think you'll see him forward in those spots. Obviously, Kendrick, you'll see forward. Johnny, I think Johnny, especially at this age, and I don't mean that in a negative. I mean, with all the skins that Johnny has on the wall, I think he's ready to lean into those conversations about you went too fast.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
yeah, like, we're going to argue with Johnny Velasquez about how he went too fast. Okay, well, I'm in the Hall of Fame. I've won more races at Saratoga than anyone else. Sorry, you know. Um, so it's interesting. It's definitely an interesting aspect of it from a turf standpoint.
Without a doubt.
Grant, before we go, I don't want to leave without talking about a horse of yours that caused me some problems. It was the only horse I missed in the pick six that day. That was Main Sequence.
Wow.
I tried to get cute.
He was a tricky horse. When he came to us, he had the reputation of not wanting to come away from the stalls very quickly. And at one point, I was even worried that he might not want to break from the stalls, from the gate. Um, I think his was a progression throughout his races. And I think when he ran in the Breeders' Cup that year, there's nobody better out of the gate than Johnny. And I think the horse had finally kind of figured it out or given up on whatever his concerns were about coming out of the gate. And I think he just really put it together that day. Very cool horse, special horse. He's still at my farm here, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's all.
Yeah.
Was he a gelding?
See him every day. Yeah, he's a gelding, and I cannot put another horse. Well, I can put certain horses with him, but he's very particular about who you put in the field with him. He can be pretty nasty. It's funny, these old warriors like him and Bellator now, they're very particular about who they hang out with.
Now, and I got this one and one more for you. If it's funny about that is I've heard that especially from a Philly standpoint, the good ones are kind of nasty, but I've also heard the other that sometimes the good ones are like puppies. Do you find a lean either way, or can a good horse come with any kind of temperament?
I mean, Shared Account and Sharing were two of the kindest horses I've ever been around. Filmmaker was very similar. I think they were very easy, kind, easy horses to fall in love with. Main Sequence and Bellator Now were tough geldings. They meant business. We kept Bellator Now here for the longest time. He actually liked the routine. I really believe that he would not have done well if he'd just gone somewhere and been turned out in the field. I think some of those old guys, they just get in the routine of what we do, and they enjoy the routine every day of walking, getting turned out for a couple of hours. They're tough guys. But look, of course, there are some ornery fillies that I'm sure some of the best fillies have the same characteristics. Most of the ones I've been around have been pretty kind, nice fillies to be around.
Graham, the last one I'll leave you with is look, I say this with a high five and a thumbs up, and I appreciate a lot of the stances that you take. You speak out in an industry that sometimes struggles to hear another side of the equation. So I usually ask people, what's one thing in this game that, kind of sticks out to you that you would like to see happen differently? You would like to change a little bit to help us, be what I think we all think we could be, considering, and I'm not one of those doom and glooms. I think that we make some mistakes and we need to get a little bit better. We need to clean some things up, and we need to be smarter, and we need to be whatever. But what are some of what's the one kind of thing that you would focus on if you were given the keys to the castle of things that we could do to kind of help improve our situation in racing?
Look, I mean, it's no secret I'm a huge proponent of HISA. I train at Fair Hill, so on any given weekend, I can be running at 5 or 6 different tracks. I mean, you know our operation. We're not afraid to ship, whether it's California, whether it's, used to be Chicago. But I mean, we run in a lot of places. So the premises of not having national rules, national guidelines is a nightmare for us. It's one thing if you're stabled at Monmouth all summer and another track in the winter. We're all over the place. It makes life extremely complicated. People think that medication positives are such you got to be a doper if you have a medication positives. Horses are like humans. They have to get treated with antibiotics, with certain things. We need national guidelines so that we're all on the same playing field. We need better security, because there's a very, very small percentage of people that want to take an edge. Like in any sport, right? In any business, there's always going to be somebody that wants to take an edge. It's not the majority, it's the absolute minority. But for that reason, we need somebody to oversee our sport better than we're doing it now. And I believe HISA isn't without faults, but we have to give it a chance, because that's what our sport is crying out for. And I think and I hope that given the chance, it'll make it a better sport for all of us.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I talk about privately all the time with friends, and is the word, and we saw it, recently, the word doping is very annoying word to me, because when I think doping, I think performance enhancing. I think 62 home runs. I think Lance Armstrong. I think steroids. I think whatever that thing was that by Barry, the clean and clear, cream and clear, whatever I think like doping is like performance enhancing. And then there's this game where we have these animals that we're the sport revolves around, and then there's like overages of therapeutics, and I think that your point is that the jurisdictions are different. So what you can do from a therapeutic standpoint one place is different than you can do at another place, and the testing process is different at one place than it is at another place, and it makes it very hard to juggle that whole situation. And then when high profile situations get overages, and then the word doping gets used, it's very confusing and very convoluted and very inaccurate.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we had this conversation. We had a HISA. I'm on a HISA not medication. I'm on a HISA advisory board, a horseman's advisory board to HISA. And we had this conversation yesterday. Doping is Lance Armstrong. These medication violations is what they are. They're violations. We're all trying to control how we handle these medications. It's a full-time job, and when every time you go to a different state, it's like going to a different country. They have different rules. I mean, I remember a long time ago, and I'm not picking on Todd at all, but a long time ago, Todd had a positive penicillin in the Breeders' Cup. No trainer is going to give a horse penicillin to run in the Breeders' Cup, right? It's because the withdrawal times were confusing. It was an accident, and we live constantly in worry of having these overages for these medications that we have to treat the horses with because the guidelines change so much. So I really think, I hate to harp on it, but I think at the end of the day, we have to give HISA a chance because, they really want to do the right thing, and they don't want to have these strange positives, whether they're, however they come about. They want to deal with them in the right way, and I think that's the way we need to go.
Yeah, I agree. And then the last thing I'll say is that I just think that, as a game, we have to recognize that although it's unfair, we are giving the public and we're giving mainstream media, we're giving them too much ammunition, which is not a great word in this country, but giving them the ammunition against us. And so whether it's fair or indifferent or they don't get it, we have to tighten up so that we don't give them that. The bottom line on ESPN the last 3 weeks has been the most annoying thing in the world to me. It's not accurate. It's not a representation of our game or the people that are involved in it. It's not a representation of some of the names we've seen on the bottom line. And maybe, it's an annoying situation, and we have to just do better. And whatever it is that makes it better, even if it's an obstacle for certain reasons, like you mentioned, we got to try to do those things.
I agree.
Graham, I appreciate you taking the time. It's been awesome to chat with you, and happy Preakness week.
Looking forward to it. Great week. Love this week.
I want to thank Graham for taking the time. I'm always amazed. I know these trainers and horsemen and owners and jockeys. It's a busy game, and the game doesn't give you a lot of time off. So I'm always appreciative when they can find a little bit of time to chat with us. Look, if you're interested in grass handicapping, I tried my hardest to get you some ideas, some insight there. A lot of questions I've always had, and I think that getting those answers from Graham is very helpful. Want to thank our friends at Guitar Racing again for supporting this podcast. I want to thank everyone from In the Money Media. I want to thank PTF, Drew, all the behind the scenes, all the other shows, Acacia, Maggie, Billy, Michelle, Matty Ice, Spencer. Who else I shows? everybody else. I want to thank all the people that support our show, the partnerships that we have in our network. We appreciate you very much. I hope that everyone has a great Preakness. I got to be honest with you, personally, I'm rooting for Mage. I know that we had a lot of people that we had on the Monster Pod that bet on First Mission. So that'll be fun for everyone if First Mission can pull it off. Never upset if Brad Cox has some success, a good friend of the network. First Mission, that'll be my second option. But I gotta be honest with you, I'm rooting for Mage for a couple of reasons. One, this will be the first year that Fox and America's Day at the Races in cooperation will have the Belmont Stakes. So why not have it be for a Triple Crown? Fox is investing a lot of money in the Triple Crown with their involvement with the Belmont Stakes. So what the heck? Let's go ahead and reward that right off the rip with a Triple Crown chance. But also, you heard Ramiro Restrepo the other day, and so I'm always rooting for my guy in a situation like that. So, look, no offense to the all the other connections, but this is a game where there's certain outcomes that are better than others. I hope you have a good Preakness. I hope you can score out. They got a contest that weekend. If you're a contest person, get involved there. And we'll see you next week, I believe. My plan is to do a podcast on Monday, and then on Tuesday, I am off to Italy to, got a little thing going on there. I'm just joking. It's a big thing. I'm very lucky to be getting married to my wonderful fiance, Jolina. So anyways, if I don't see you this week, I should. But if I don't, that's why. I'll be back prior to Belmont, and we'll get started again. I got a video on the horizon. I think everyone will enjoy it. We'll see you soon.
I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything. Now you be surprised at the info you get is by letting them talk, so I'm letting them talk.